HurricaneCity.com
presents Weather and the Media with your host, Jim Williams.
I love the storm right in the eye. Wonder if I will survive. People think that I'm insane, 'cause I stand out in the rain. I wonder what tomorrow brings. I wonder what tomorrow.
How do you manage to stay on the air at that station when the other channels got knocked off the air? And is your current station prepared to do the same?
Well, we were very lucky. On television, we were transmitting on a condemned tower.
Do you miss being the director?
It was fun, but the bureaucracy is just maddening.
Welcome to the wonderful world of high technology.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Weather and the Media Show. I'm your host, Jim Williams, for February 1st, 2012. I have a great guest tonight. Our next guest for tonight is Ken Kaye from the Sun Sentinel, newspaper in the South Florida area. Here's Ken. Will be with us in about 15 to 20 minutes. He'll be calling in, and we're going to talk about everything related to producing weather information not in the newspaper down in South Florida. Now, here's the thing. I know a lot of you are listening from other parts of the country, but this newspaper has a circulation, I think, of a couple of million. So a lot of people get these papers from all over the country. The website is very well known in the hurricane circles. So Ken does know a lot about hurricanes and the weather, and we're going to ask him about that. Not only that, but how does he do his job? We're also going to ask him about this crazy weather we've been having lately with all the warm temperatures all over the country, and we're going to talk about the upcoming hurricane season. Who does he think the next director is going to be? He spends a lot of time at the conferences. He goes to the Hurricane Center a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Bill Phillips is always with me on these shows lately, and he's Skyped in tonight. Bill, let me go ahead and pull this up and get you on the air. And Bill's from Virginia Beach tonight. Bill, how you doing?
Good evening, and great to be with you on another edition of Weather and the Media. I look forward to the responses from Mr. Kaye this evening. This should be fun.
All right, now, Bill, you've been having really warm weather up there. What's your situation with the temperatures up there right now?
It was 70 and sunny this afternoon.
That's unbelievable. Now, what's your temperature right now? It's 74 here right now in Delray Beach.
Probably down towards 60. It drops quickly after dark, and we'll be in the 50s tomorrow. This was a one-day spike in the temps. But still, 53, 54, that's where we should be. I mean, very rarely have we been down in the 30s and 40s this year at all. I mean, it has been very, very warm. I mean, I'm sitting here in shorts in my tennis shoes right now. And it's the 1st of February. You're not supposed to be able to do that up here.
What were you doing last year at this time?
We had 2 or 3 snowfalls. One snowfall of 14 plus inches, and it was down in the 20s. It's cold. The previous 2 years here have been really, really brutal with the cold, but this year is, to this point, it's been a complete 180. And I see no changes in the weather pattern whatsoever. I mean, yeah, it's going to get colder, 40s and 50s, but still, that's right about average for my area. No extreme cold, and I really don't see your warm weather should continue as well, Jim.
Yeah, it's nothing. We're going to ask Ken about that when he calls in about 15 minutes, what his thoughts are and why this is happening. Of course, I know it's a jet stream issue, but still pretty unusual nevertheless.
I hear the tone, so it must be him.
All right. Ken, are you on the line?
I'm right here, Jim.
All right, thanks for calling in, Ken. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Kaye from the Fort Lauderdale, actually the Sun Sentinel News. Ken, thank you for joining us. Where are you calling in from tonight, Ken?
I'm
actually... Ken, where did you say you were calling in from?
I'm calling in from Weston.
Okay, Weston, all right. Okay. Oh, well, that Weston now...
It's better, though.
Yeah, I can hear him a little bit better now. But anyway, okay, you're calling in from Weston. thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate you joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Okay, Ken, first of all, before I get into your how you do your job and what goes on at the Sun Sentinel, what do you think about this crazy weather we're having all over the country right now? Very warm temperatures, very little snowfall. What do you think is happening right now around the country?
Well, I mean, the Weather Service has, predicted all along that we were in for a warmer, drier winter as a result of La Nina. And, everybody knows what that is. It's the force that nurtures hurricanes during the summer. But, during the winter, it has that tendency. It has different effects in different parts of the country. But its overall effect is, it makes the jet streams basically move further to the north. And when that happens, the country does not receive as much cold air and, of course, the moisture associated, with the storms. So that's basically what's going on. And I know that also, at least in Florida and the southeast, there's been persistent high pressure. That's always a factor in creating heat. That whenever news happens, if you will, something, comes along that needs to be reported, I could end up writing a story, or I could end up writing that under my regular blog. So it's not like I have two pages. It's just that the way our home page works, I basically write on demand.
Yeah. Now today you have a comment about the rip tides, rip currents, and a breezy start to February.
Right.
And so that's what we're linking to right now from Hurricane City. And now is this the page to go to when there's a hurricane out there for people to find out what your thoughts are on that and what you're talking about?
Yep. Go right to sunsentinel.com/KenK. But whenever there's a hurricane out there, Jim, or hurricane news, if you've ever seen the Sun Sentinel homepage, we don't make it hard for people to find, what I'm writing.
Right.
I mean, we've got a great big hurricane display right at the top of the page. Excuse me. And the story's usually played very big and very prominently right on the front page.
Right.
But if you're out of town or whatever, and you're just generally trying to find me and my blog, it's just sunsentinel.com/KenK, and there I am.
And you're pretty well known in the weather business. I've seen you at the conferences. I know you get a lot of publicity for your articles, and I was wonder, I'm going to get to that in a few questions from now about how you do your job. But Bill and I were talking. By the way, the other voice you're hearing, this is Bill Phillips. He's from Virginia Beach, and he helps me do these shows every now and then, and helps me with the website. So, Bill, if you want to introduce yourself to Ken, you guys can say hello. And Bill has a few questions for you as well.
Good evening, Ken. I'll let Jim continuing with the question, though, although I have a couple of questions for you as we go forward. Pleasure to talk with you.
Where are you originally from?
I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where I was born and raised. Spent 26 pretty miserable winters there before I came down here to Florida. And I've been here in Florida now for 33 years, so I've been around the block. I'm kind of an old guy, if you do the math.
And what brought you down here?
It's a long story, but basically it was the job. I had been working at a weekly newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio for 4 years. I have two brothers who were in the car business. They moved down here to Florida, and when they moved, I, started applying to the Sun Sentinel. And after actually about 3 years of applying and 3 years of their telling me to get lost, they finally turned around and hired me. So I've been at the Sun Sentinel ever since. That's 33 years ago.
That's a long time to be doing media. What got you into the weather stuff? Or was that something you wanted to do, or how did that all start?
Well, first of all, I'm a pilot, or at least I was a pilot. And when I was in college, I was a flight instructor, and after college, I flew some charter. And when you're a pilot, you have to study a lot of weather. I mean, you're not, a meteorologist per se, but as you get progressively farther along in your flying career, the more and more weather you have to learn. So like your average airline pilot knows a heck of a lot of weather. And when the Sun Sentinel found out that I was a pilot and knew that I knew about weather, they pretty much put me on that beat immediately. What happened was I ended up becoming an editor for 10 years, and I came back to reporting after that, and my primary beat was aviation because I was a pilot. And at the time, there was another reporter who was covering hurricanes and tropical weather. He moved along, and the moment he did, they just tapped me because it was kind of a natural thing to link aviation and weather together. And that's going on about 15 years ago when that happened.
So I know in our emails back and forth, you said if some news story doesn't break, that I'll be willing to come on the show. And so I guess that means that if any kind of major news story breaks, you cover it, or how does that factor into what you do?
Well, for all intents and purposes, I'm a general assignment reporter. I mean, it's funny, I'm not even quite sure what my title is other than a senior reporter, senior weather reporter, just because I'm an old guy. But I'm a general assignment reporter, which means, if the Sun Sentinel needs me to, I'll cover a city meeting. I might end up covering a murder. I mean, I could end up going to court and covering a case. Generally, that doesn't happen too much these days. We got reporters who specialize in all these areas, but the Sun Sentinel, like every other newspaper in the country, we've streamlined, and that means fewer reporters, and that means the reporters remaining have to do a little bit more.
But basically, if it's a disaster-type situation, whether it's a hurricane or, God forbid we have a meteorite or something heading for the planet, you would be the guy to go to, right?
Usually I'm involved in the big story in some manner, shape, or form. But, I mean, on the other hand, if there's a triple murder, or let's say that horrible accident that happened in Gainesville happened down here, that was a major disaster, and in all likelihood, I'm not going to be the main reporter on that. I may end up contributing, because usually with a story like that, the editors look around the newsroom and pull in everybody they can. But generally the reporter who has the expertise in a given area anchors the story, as we call it, meaning they're the ones who basically get all the information. They're the clearinghouse of information, and then they turn around and write the story. My main areas would be aviation and hurricanes. So if you see a plane crash, there's a good chance my byline's going to be on it.
All right. Now, Bill, this was going to be your question. You want to try to take it about the most interesting story, or you want to try to ask him, and if he can't hear you, I'll repeat it.
I'll have you relay it to Ken if he can't hear me. But, what is in your 33-year career at the Sun Sentinel, what is the most interesting story you've covered?
Well, that's a good question. I've covered a lot of them. I would have to say that the Value Jet crash was probably the most interesting story I ever covered. 110 people, died in one fell swoop in the swamp, and that was a story that, like hurricanes, they can end up taking your time for 4 or 5 days, but the Value Jet story absolutely dominated the news for weeks. And I remember that I worked literally 3 weeks without taking a day off after that plane crashed. And what was most interesting, or at least kind of coincidental, was the day that it crashed, I was actually assigned to cover the Air and Sea Show out on Fort Lauderdale's beach. And so I walk into the newsroom that day. This is, by the way, back almost before cell phones were popular and in use. I walk into the newsroom, and some reporter said, "Wait, you heard about that plane crash?" And I'm dripping sweat. I'm tired from covering that Air and Sea show. And I said, "What plane crash?" And then I quickly found out, it was a DC-9 airliner. And from there, after having to turn around and after having to write the Air and Sea show story, I turned around and wrote 3 stories about the value jet crash for the next day's paper. So I don't know if most interesting is the right way to put it, but that was definitely the most challenging.
That was a huge story. I remember that going on for a long time. A tragic story out there. So, Ken, how long have you had an interest in hurricanes, though?
I basically got thrust into it again when I was tapped to be the hurricane reporter about 15 years ago. And I have always had, an interest in severe weather. I studied weather again in college, and my thesis in college, believe it or not, was on tornadoes. So I knew all about anticyclones and cyclones and low-pressure systems and all of that. But to be honest with you, I didn't really learn a whole lot about hurricanes until I got into the hurricane game, which is when you're a hurricane reporter, you end up going to a ton of conferences, where, they give seminars, they teach you all about the various aspects of hurricanes, and also just from actually turning around and having to cover a season. So,
do you fear hurricanes, and have you ever been in one?
Fear, no. I mean, I don't think I'm going to get killed in a hurricane. But dread hurricanes, yeah. I dread them because of what they do to my life. They affect me on 2 different fronts. One is professionally, which is, just a ton of pressure to produce stories and information for both our homepage and for the print editions. And then how they affect me at home, which is, I have to make sure my home is secure and make sure that the people I love are taken care of.
Right.
So I would say that I dread hurricanes because the other part of them is, after a hurricane passes, your life is pretty much miserable for a few days. Everybody saw that with Wilma.
Now, you write a lot of different type of stories about weather and hurricanes, and so what when you go to write a story, is it at your request or by the management? In other words, what triggers a story?
It's actually both. I would say that, about 70% of what I write is my ideas and or information that came to me. I'm always getting bombarded with press releases, and that's one. And I get information just from talking to people. I mean, and I may end up saying something here in this conversation that may trigger a story idea. We get ideas just from following up on the news. Things happen in news stories, and you sit around and think about it and think maybe there's an angle to a news story that needs to be developed a little bit further. I mean, that happened actually just this past week, where there was a bad turbulence incident on a plane from Brazil to Miami, and we turned around, my editors and I, and said, how does this really affect people? How many people really experience turbulence and how many people really get hurt by it? And we turned around and did a story saying that actually flight attendants are the ones who most get hurt by turbulence because they're the ones who aren't strapped in. So stories, my editors, they can do the same thing. My editors are weather crazy, meaning they'll look outside and they'll see anything that's a little bit out of the norm, and they'll turn around and say to me, what can we do with this to make it into a weather story? And I had a story in today's paper that was a little bit of that ilk. My editors said, hey, we had one burst of cold, and it seems like we're done. Are we done with winter? Was winter basically 2 days at the beginning of January? And I end up doing a little story today that says, we've been warm basically during January, and there's no real cold in sight.
Do they ever tell you, no, we can't run that story, it's not worth it?
Yep. And over my career, I've had many stories killed. I mean, it hurts because, it happens for various reasons. I mean, sometimes an editor asks for a story that they envision it one way. They may actually have a preconceived notion on the facts, and you turn around and actually research the story and find out the facts don't fit what they thought it was going to be, and the story ends up dying.
Okay, gotcha. Now, what about other things other than weather? What are your interests? Like, are you interested in sports or anything like that? Or what else are you interested in?
Well, I love sports. I love football. I'm looking forward to the Super Bowl.
Who's your pick for the Super Bowl?
Well, I cannot go against Tom Brady, and I just think, I'm not even sure who's favored. I just think that Tom Brady's probably the better of the two quarterbacks, and that probably is going to make the difference in that game.
Yep, that's what I'm thinking, too. I think New England's going to get out to a real quick start because Tom Brady's going to hear about Manning all week long, and he's going to start hearing about how the Giants beat him last time, and I think he's going to get fired up and have it come out scoring really quick. But I think the Giants will make a game out of it at the end, but I think New England will find a way to pull it out. Bill, what do you think about that? Bill? You know what? We might have lost him. That might have been what that click noise was.
I'm on here. I just muted my microphone.
Okay, who do you like for the Super Bowl?
I've got New England. I think New England will win.
Wait a minute. You said the Giants earlier. What happened?
Oh yeah, no, I did. My bad. I tried. But did I not give you that score of 30-27? I'm waffling back and forth. But
all
no,
right.
I did put it on paper with Jim. I've got Giants winning by 3, 30-27.
So you flip-flopped in a matter of just a short period of time. That's amazing. All right, so we got 3 New Englands here. We'll see what happens.
Bill, I've got one final question, and then I have to run for the evening.
You were going to ask him, Mike. I got it written down. Go ahead.
What is your most memorable weather event that you've covered in South Florida? And I'll go ahead and throw one of your questions in because I want to hear the answer before I sign off. Who do you think the new Hurricane Center director will be?
Well, in terms of the most memorable weather thing, I mean, it's probably very obvious, and that was Wilma. Just because that was the one hurricane that really brought the entire South Florida area into hurricane experience, if you will. I was here for Andrew, and I was, I covered Andrew, but because that was really, at the time, the Sun Sentinel didn't cover Miami-Dade as carefully as we should have, that was not a story that I was deeply involved in. But Wilma, that was a big story that I was involved in, again, for many days. And everybody in South Florida who was here then is never going to forget that one. So many people thought it was a Category 2, a Category 3, and they were very, very surprised to learn that for all intents and purposes, for the majority of the area, it was a Category 1. So,
that's right. Yep.
That's probably the most interesting weather story. The Hurricane Center director, if he applies, and that's the word, if he applies, the current deputy director, Ed Rappaport, is a shoo-in. It's pretty much his job to take or leave.
Now, is that who you want to be the director, or is that who you think is going to be the director?
That's who I think is going to be the director if he applies. Now, who do I want to be the director? I'm not allowed to say that because I'm supposed to be an objective reporter.
All right. You know what? I can't argue that case about Ed Rappaport. I mean, he turned down the job before, and the only thing about it, well, this is kind of goes into another question, Ken. I wanted to ask you about this. Is a question I was going to have a little bit later on, but You know how they do the live reports from the Hurricane Center? It's usually the director, at least that's the way it was for years.
Right.
And now it seems like they put either the deputy director on there or somebody else, one of their lead forecasters, goes on camera. I remember the days of Neil Frank, and every time there was anything out there, he was in front of the camera. And you didn't see it as much with Bill Reed, which if Ed Rappaport becomes the director, would you like to see him on camera doing all the updates, or is a director better served working behind the scenes?
No, I would personally rather see the director. I mean, I think Max Mayfield was an example of how people, just want to hear it from the top. You and I both know that Max Mayfield was not a guy made for television. He did not have a television voice. He was kind of soft-spoken and all of that. But just the same, he was the top man at the Hurricane Center. He was the authority figure, and everybody kind of felt better hearing it from him. The thing about Ed Rappaport is he's got a lot of television experience. Ed started out as a television meteorologist. I think that was in Texas. I'm not sure. Don't quote me. But, he's comfortable in front of a camera, and he's been on camera many times during many storms. So he's got his cool. He keeps it cool.
I mean, the only thing about Ed Rappaport, though, I watched him a lot during...
He's comatose.
Yeah, he's a little bit kind of boring, I guess, in front of the camera. I saw him when Hurricane Katrina was hitting Mississippi and Louisiana. And, I mean, he's talking about the storm surge, going up to 30 feet. And the way he was delivering the message, it came across almost as if this is just standard procedure, nothing to be alarmed about. I mean, that's the impression I got from Ed Rappaport was he was putting me to sleep, I mean, I remember, maybe it's not fair to compare everybody to Neil Frank, but Neil Frank used to scream at the camera if he knew people were going to die. And with Ed Rappaport, it was kind of a real timid type of an approach. And I'm thinking it'd be maybe nice for them to get somebody that's a little bit more animated in front of the camera. Maybe it'll save a little more lives down there. What do you think?
Well, I think that what people really want is accuracy. And what they really want is what's for real. And it's something that even I take with me in my hurricane reporting, and that is I don't veer from the forecast. I don't throw in my interpretation of what the storm, might do, other than to stay pretty strictly with the forecast. Now, Ed Rappaport is a guy who plays it straight. There's no question about that. If you put somebody on there who is going to inspire, maybe some fear, maybe somebody who comes across more as a television meteorologist, and you know that some of those guys do not have good reputations because they're blamed for trying to hype things up and get people excited. That's not what people really want. People really want the facts. They want the forecast, and they want it played straight.
Yep, you just really triggered something in my head about Irene, and this really got me fired up. I was doing my hurricane warning show at Hurricane City when we do Bill and I tag team and cover hurricanes when they're hitting land. We just basically show people how the media is covering the story, and it seemed like the Weather Channel just went over the top with Hurricane Irene. I mean, I know it was potentially a major hurricane for the Northeast, but we saw the wheels coming off of this hurricane in the Bahamas. I mean, when it was leaving the Bahamas, it was falling apart. And Brian Norcross, who I have a great deal of respect for, the guy carried everybody through Hurricane Andrew and did a great job, but that whole presentation on the Weather Channel seemed like it was Armageddon to the hilt, and it really didn't justify that kind of hype. And what did you think about that coverage of Hurricane Irene?
We're talking about the latest Irene, right? The one that just hit the Northeast.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
I kind of tend to agree with you. I felt like what everybody was trying to do was play on the fact that New York City was a big target waiting to get hit. And of course, New York City being, New York City, if you can get them all excited, you've got ratings. The Hurricane Center early on made it pretty clear that they thought Irene was not going to be a hurricane by the time it got that far north. So I don't know if it was Brian Norcross or not. I got to be honest, I don't remember. I do remember seeing some forecasts that I thought were a bit over the top. Now, all that said, the Northeast did need to be on its toes, as it turned out, because Irene turned out to be a huge rainmaker, a huge flood maker,
right,
for a bunch of those states. And a lot of those states, had their worst flooding in years. A little bit different than a full-blown hurricane.
Yeah, and that was a lot of that was pre-existing flooding and rain that had already swollen the area up pretty good. So when Irene came in there, it just exasperated and made things even worse. But I mean, I heard references to the 1938 Long Island Express,
right.
And it was just a way over the top. And it goes to what you said earlier about the director being calm in front of the camera. As much as I'd like to see somebody animated, at the same time, you want somebody that's calm and collected when it's really bad, so you don't have mass hysteria, which I think they kind of created up there in the Northeast for Irene. But I don't know. I just thought it was a little over the top.
Well, I agree with you. And the one thing about the people out there, they're not stupid. An awful lot of those people who follow weather and follow your website, follow my website, they're weather savvy. So they know, when you're hyping it. They know when you're not exactly following a forecast.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen a bunch of comments on my blog. I mean, it takes the very smallest thing for people to criticize me. And frequently, it's not even me they're criticizing. They're criticizing just the way the story's played on our homepage. Sometimes they're criticizing the headline, which I may or may not have written. And they're the people. That's evidence right there that what people really want is they just want the straight forecast. Now, like you said, sometimes playing it straight lulls people to sleep, and that can be dangerous because if everybody kind of turns away and says, oh, no big deal, not really realizing the potential for damage, then you're in trouble.
Ken, who's your favorite local TV weatherman in the South Florida market?
Well, it's probably not going to be very popular to say, but I like Phil Farrow.
Will Ferrell, okay.
I do like Phil Farrow.
All right.
And I'll tell you why. The main thing is, I know that people, accuse him of trying to hype things up and all of that. But here's what Phil does. Phil at least gives you he will at least provide a track for you, and he will at least provide you the reasoning for that track. And that may be with something where the Hurricane Center has not even put a track out. And what I'm saying is he's giving you the different scenarios that could happen.
I love that, yep.
And, like, for instance, when there's just a depression out there, and we're all dying to know what's the potential for this thing to hit South Florida. We all want to know it really bad. I can turn on another meteorologist, and they go the complete opposite direction. They've been told, do not scare people, do not hype it up, let's not get people accusing us of, overplaying it for ratings. And therefore, they give you one sentence. There's a tropical depression out there. Here's today's weather in South Florida. That's not what we want. What we want is, here's the high-pressure system that may steer this thing this way or that way, and here's its potential to grow. Phil does that. That's why I like him. He may not be right, and when he's not right, he'll come back and get it right the next time around. I got a lot of respect for a lot of them, though, Jim, to be honest with you. I know that job that they do is hard, and very hard when a hurricane's coming. I mean, probably because of Brian Norcross, most of them have a real bunker mentality, meaning they're not going to leave the station. They have cots in the back room. they'll go in the back and take a couple hours rest, and then they're back out on camera again. And I actually did a story about the TV meteorologists and how they handled hurricanes. I mean, some of those guys are, working straight through for, 4 or 5 days. So I respect them, and I know they're, most of them are pretty good, at least with the meteorology part of it.
Ken, what do you think hurricanes are going to continue to get worse, and what impacts do you expect in South Florida? As far as, we have the sea level rise to worry about, we have a higher population down here. What are your thoughts regarding what we've been through and what is to come? And do you think people are prepared? I mean, keep in mind we've only been dealing with these Cat 1s and 2s hitting South Florida. Really haven't any majors since Andrew. You could count Charlie on the West Coast. But what are your thoughts on the impacts to South Florida?
Well, here's the first thing. You got to remember that global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, be that or not, you can get hit by a Category 5 hurricane, okay? Major hurricanes can hit South Florida any year, whether it's during a period of hurricane intensity or whether it's a very slow year. And you've heard it a million times. Hurricane Andrew is the perfect example. The Category 5 during a very slow season. So the first thing to remember is major hurricanes can form during hurricane season no matter what. Now, in terms of climate change and all of that, there's lots and lots of evidence that climate change is happening, that global warming is happening. I mean, 2010, I guess, was the warmest year on record, and something like the last 34, 35 years in a row have been above the 20th century average. Lots of data. The Arctic ice, every year the coverage is a little bit less. So in other words, the melting is a little bit greater every year. And a lot of the experts think that man-made gases have something to do with that.
Right.
Now, do I think that Florida is going to go underwater, that our roads are going to be covered, that our drinking wells are going to be ruined, that species are going to be picked off one by global warming? I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason is because you got to remember that man-made, contribution or not, the Earth goes through cycles of cooling and warming. And
well, yeah, but you could argue the fact that those cooling and warming were triggered by events around the globe that caused the cooling to happen, like for all the past ice ages, from everything I've read anyway. It seems that there's been either volcanic activity or asteroid impacts that were unreported originally. They found that in core samples. There were catastrophic events on the globe that caused us to go into these ice ages. So what's to say if we don't have another catastrophic event to cool the temperatures of the planet, that we're not going to continue to warm, and then sea level rise is going to be a problem for South Florida? In fact, did you hear the story about the local communities, politicians coming up with plans, emergency management plans for the future for raising roads and stuff like that because of sea level rise?
I've heard of it. And, they're probably doing what's cautious and what they need to do. But I'm not sure that I agree with you that it's going to take a catastrophic event to trigger a cooling cycle. I think that the Earth does have cycles. It's been shown through the geologic record, I think it is, that the Earth has regularly cooled and warmed over its history. And I think that that cooling is eventually going to overcome anything that is man-made gases in the long run. Now, I could be wrong, and I do think that we're going to see some evidence of global warming. We'll probably see some sea rise. We've already seen it. But I just don't think it's going to be catastrophic the way some people think it will be, just because I think we're eventually going to go into a cooling period. And even the Atlantic Ocean by itself, as you know, goes through cycles of warming and cooling. And supposedly within the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, we'll pull out of this period of intensity. There's a guy at the Hurricane Center, I'm sure you know him, Chris Lancy.
Yes.
He's the Science and Operations Officer. He did a study about how he thought global warming would affect hurricanes. And he concluded that, global warming exists. Global warming probably is, produced in part by man-made gases. But he feels that hurricanes will increase in intensity only slightly by the end of, this century. And I've heard that from other experts as well, that they do not anticipate, there's going to be a, mega super hurricanes developing as a result in the future. There is one guy out there, and you've probably heard of him, the guy from MIT, Kaye, I think his name is Emanuel.
Kaye Emanuel, yep.
And he thinks that, from now on, cooling or not of the Earth, we are in for, more major hurricanes and more intense hurricanes into the future. And there's some people who buy into that. But
well, I know you talk about the cycles and everything, and scientists can dispute and can go back and forth on that, but the temperatures on all the other planets in our solar system are continuing to rise as well, which would indicate that the sun is increasing its intensity. I don't know, all the science programs I've watched on the History Discovery Channel over the years, all the astronomers and everybody believe that the sun is going to continue to get warmer, to hotter and hotter as time goes by. So even with the cycles, if they're happening, they're not going to be able to, I don't think, overcome the rapid warming of the Earth by actually things that have nothing to do with us in general. I mean, that could argue against the CO2 argument to say that the sun is what's really heating us up. It has nothing to do with CO2, although the CO2 helps trap the heat. I don't know. I guess we'll live to. I'm hoping. I'd like to see in 30 years if we go back into a cool cycle, because I asked. We were sitting together when I asked him this question. I think he said in about 3 or 4 years we're going to know. And this was about 3 or 4 years ago, if we don't go back into a cooling phase, and we're still not going back into a cooling phase. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in 20 or 30 years from now. Are we going to have to start relocating people because of the sea level rise, or is this all just going to go away and it's just a lot of talk, I guess we just agree to disagree on that, but I think it's something to be concerned about in South Florida.
I've had these water spots in my garage, and I can't figure out where they're coming from. And everybody has told me that it's from the rising water table. So at least I know now that global warming is the reason I've got these stains, water stains in my garage, rather than like a broken pipe under my concrete.
Yeah, true. It's going to be interesting to watch. I don't know how old you are, Ken. I'm going to be 50 pretty soon, so I'm hoping if I live to be 80, maybe I'll see if I'm right on that or not. Like, if it was something we really needed to be worried about, or if it was all just a bunch of just talk over nothing. It's going to be fun to see.
Well, I mean, this is one of those things where you err on the side of caution. I mean, if we're all going to turn our backs and say global warming's not for real, it's a fraud and all of that, we may get a bad surprise in the future. And especially when it comes to stuff like water tables and drinking water and stuff that can be sensitive, and it doesn't take a whole lot of sea level rise to have an effect on that. That's something you got to take a look at. But once again, my feelings of actually seeing roads go underwater and some of the horrible impacts that are being projected, I just personally don't think we're going to see that, at least not in our lifetimes. So.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens down the road.
By the way, I didn't know that about the sun. I had no idea that the sun was warming up. And so my question to you is that George Bush's fault?
Of course.
Because, he's to blame for the whole global warming thing.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that. I don't think he's blaming him for it. I mean, look, I think scientists are pretty much in agreement that the CO2 is trapping gas that traps heat, and we're seeing more and more of it. And it's not really the United States that's the biggest problem. It's China and India right now that's got the biggest emissions going on, and not to mention all the automobiles that are in. More and more automobiles on the road and people driving and more asphalt being put down and more, you name it. We just need to be careful, I think, about our future. And I don't know that either one of us is particularly right here, but I think you're right to say that we need to keep talking about it. It needs to be on the table, but we definitely can't take it off the table because of politics, though, either.
I agree with you. And you have to consider, too, that when you look at the globe, I mean, really, that atmosphere of air is a sealed envelope. If there's emissions in China, in California, and everywhere else, eventually those emissions are going to affect the entire globe. That's the way it works because we're all under the same atmospheric envelope.
Right.
So, and when you think about it in those terms, yeah, I mean, that's why I do believe, and I agree with all the big scientists who say, yeah, man is probably contributing to global warming. I'm just questioning whether we're going to see the catastrophic of, effects. And the reason I say that too, Jim, is because when you say catastrophic, I mean that implies that things should already be happening in terms of actually seeing the kinds of destruction that they're talking about, and we're not.
Well, we can see them, like in the case of Katrina. An interesting concept with that hurricane, too, because I went up there for the hurricane conference in New Orleans in 2005 before Katrina hit, and I went and did a lot of viewing in the areas that were impacted by Camille, and I saw the storm surge pole that they have in Mississippi, and took a lot of video, and then sure enough, right after that, Hurricane Katrina hit, and it knocked down the pole that Camille caused the storm surge of, 23 feet or whatever that storm surge was. Katrina just annihilated that. Actually, technically, a weaker hurricane than Camille. Supposedly, I still have debate about whether Camille was stronger than Katrina when Katrina was out in the middle of the Gulf, but the consensus is that Camille was stronger. So a stronger hurricane causing us a smaller surge. You could argue the time that it came in, high tide, low tide, it was a larger hurricane than Camille. But, I mean, it shattered that storm surge. And they even built houses in Mississippi to make them storm surge proof because of what they learned from Camille. And those houses were completely wiped off the map. So here in South Florida, we're not really battle tested. We're looking at Andrew, which was a small Category 5 hurricane that affected less populated areas. A lot of those areas were not directly up against the coast. So if you put a bigger hurricane in South Florida with sea level rise, and even a tiny sea level rise can make a huge difference in a storm surge, and we could see big problems from hurricanes. And that was going to lead into my final question from you. What would you suggest to people in South Florida, from Ken Kaye's perspective, what people should expect in the future, in your opinion, and should they be concerned? What should they be preparing for in the future as far as dealing with storm surge, high winds, hurricanes? Should they evacuate? Should they not? Even if you're inland, they tell you not to evacuate. But what are your thoughts for people in South Florida as a final word from you in regards to the future and hurricanes?
Well, what I would say to everybody is what officialdom tells them, and that is every single year, no matter what, you just got to be prepared. I mean, if you're going to ask me, do I think we're going to see more powerful hurricanes, and, are we more prone to see more powerful hurricanes? Well, our number sure seems to be coming up because, hurricanes on average hit us once every 4 years, and major hurricanes hit us something like once every 9 years, I believe it is. So every single year, everybody's got to prepare the same way. You cannot take a season lightly. You can't listen to seasonal forecasts that may call for a slow season or a fast season and say, you know, I'm going to do my planning, my preparation based on that. No, you can't do that. I mean, if you're smart, you're getting all your non-perishable stuff and getting your house in order and all of that even before the hurricane season starts. And me personally, I start bringing in, you know, canned food and stuff that I'm probably going to hang on to for 6 months or longer.
Okay, who are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from the Bahamas.
Oh, really? Okay, great. Ken, can you hear him okay?
Just barely.
Okay, what's your question for Ken K?
Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm doing good, doing good.
This is Wayne Neely from the Bahamas. I did a show with you about regard to hurricanes. Do you think that they will become stronger, or what's the scenario on the future for hurricanes in the short term?
Ken, did you hear him okay?
Yeah. Well, I didn't really hear the gentleman's name. I mean, we're in a period of hurricane intensity. Once again, that has made us more active than usual. And when you're in this period of intensity, you're more likely to get more activity, meaning a greater number of storms. And we have seen several of the past years since 1995 have been what's known as hyperactive. So the chances are pretty good that major hurricanes are going to form. Probably greater than average number will form per year. That gentleman has to keep in mind that the Caribbean always has a high chance of seeing a major hurricane every single year.
Yeah, they do. That was, by the way, his name was Wayne. He's from Nassau and works with the Weather Service over there. So I think he already hung up, but he's probably listening online.
Okay. So just to finish the thought there, Jim, nobody should take hurricane season lightly, okay? We're going to predict doom because we could have a very slow year next year. In fact, the experts, if you will, some of them are already predicting that we're going to see an average year next year because they say the Atlantic is already cooling a bit, and that there may even be an El Nino. But all that aside, that doesn't preclude the possibility of a major hurricane hitting.
You know, the stat that really gets me is we haven't been hit by a major, ever gone more than 6 years without a major hitting somewhere in the United States. And we're already going into year 7 here coming up. So that's pretty ominous as far as, we're talking over 150 years of data. That's never happened before.
Well, even more scary is that Florida has never gone 6 hurricane seasons without a hurricane until this year.
That's right.
So,
yep.
That's what tells me, that our number is probably up. But that doesn't mean we'll get hit in South Florida. That doesn't mean we'll be hit in Tampa. But Florida is a big target. You know it, and I know it. 1,300 miles of shoreline sticking right down into Hurricane Alley. Florida's got to keep its eyes open every year. But I would say this year we need to keep our eyes open.
Yeah, and that Hurricane City database is a good place to look to see return rates for tropical storms and hurricanes. Kind of breaks it down. The most likely area for a major is Key Largo out of the entire Atlantic Basin. So there's a lot of interesting stats in there. If you ever get a chance to surf around in there, Ken, you'll find a lot of good interesting.
I've been to your website and I enjoy it.
Okay, we have another caller. You want to take another caller before you go?
Okie doke.
All right, let's see if this guy can hear us. Okay, caller, go ahead.
Hi there, Jim.
Yes.
Hi, it's Bobby.
Hey,
Storm. How you
Bobby.
doing?
Long time no hear. How you been doing?
Yeah, it's been a good couple of months. How you doing?
Good. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Raleigh, but I'll be back in Miami in about 2 weeks.
Okay. All right.
So I'm kind of getting views on things from both sides. First of all, the site looks beautiful.
Oh.
I haven't had a chance to tell you, but I was looking through some of the things today, and it really is looking good.
Well, thanks. Got a new logo up there, and new
Yeah.
navigation bar and everything. So.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and the logo, wow. And also, I've been listening in to Ken. I wanted to ask a couple questions, but I thought it would be interesting considering I've been listening the whole evening. I was doing some work on another site, doing some writing, and I missed a short part, so I hope this wasn't asked. But since Ken lives out in Weston, I think a lot of times there's a false sense of safety when people do live out in Weston. I heard you talking about the pothole, and people feel, well, like I'm not on the coast, and I don't live over in Hollywood, and I don't live in Miami Beach, so I live all the way out in Weston. But question on construction, in the newer construction and the homes and low level of sea level out there and concentration of people, how safe people really, how he feels Weston or areas like Weston would hold up in a really strong storm if you had a storm that came in and it sort of barreled across the state and kept its intensity for a long time, like some storms have done, for instance.
Was
Bobby, you're talking about a storm that's coming
I just wanted to ask
from
also, I'm really impressed, we talk here and there on Twitter, and I'm very impressed by what a writer. I didn't realize the meteorology wasn't like your original, I don't know what you didn't mention what your degree in college was. Is your degree in English or in journalism or?
Would you believe my degree in college was geography?
I believe that.
I went to the University of Denver, and at the University of Denver, that was the department that taught the most about aviation and meteorology.
Uh-huh. No, I believe that, 100%.
But, Bobby, to answer your question, you're talking about a storm that's coming from east to west across the ocean, correct?
East to west or, headed west-northwest, but some storms maintain, a strong storm would maintain intensity as opposed to going straight up the coast or a near hit.
The Hurricane Center actually did a little study on that. And are you there? Can you hear me?
I'm here.
Okay. They did a little study which basically said, that even areas out as far as Weston would experience, let's say if a major hurricane came in, Category 3, would still experience Category 3 winds. In other words, extreme winds. And they did that because they based it on the 1926 hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that the major hurricane winds did go all the way, I can't remember how far west, but it was as far west
they went
as west,
inland.
not
That's
further.
one of my specialties. That's fun.
And you got to remember one other thing. Like Andrew, when it hit Florida, it only downgraded by one category by the time it, crossed over to the
Mm-hmm.
Gulf. So hurricanes, they maintain their intensity. The only good part about living this far west is you don't have to worry about storm surge. But winds and heavy rains and the potential for flooding, yeah.
Like some of the storms in the 40s where you had massive flooding out in Hialeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's my big fear is we're going to get a hurricane coming through here, regardless of what direction it's coming from. And there's going to be so much water that people that think that they're not in an evacuation zone, that are outside the surge zone, are going to be found with water coming in their living rooms. That's my big fear from us in inland areas like we're in Weston and places like that.
Well, yeah, and you got to remember that Florida has so much water, and that inland flooding, they call it freshwater flooding, is a huge killer. At one point, I can't remember, I think they said that it actually killed more people than storm surge, but don't hold me to that. The bottom line is that several of the past hurricane deaths have been the result of either people driving into, what amounts to a sinkhole, or they didn't see underground wires and got electrocuted.
Well, that was very tragic after even some of the smaller storms where that became an issue. But, if you're on the coast, you can sort of run from the storm surge. But if you're living out in the ranches, it's a lot harder to run from storm surge. but you can still have massive amounts of inland flooding. And, there's a lot of people moved up from South Dade up to West Broward and up to West after Andrew. They moved out to some of the newer subdivisions feeling that somehow they were safer than when they were down in Cutler Ridge or in Homestead, which is sort of an illusion on some levels because you really, like you said, a storm can maintain intensity far inland. In the 1926 hurricanes, which I write about a lot, a lot depended on construction as well, because some of the homes that were built out in Hialeah and Opelika were not built to the same construction standards that George Merrick had built in Coral Gables. And areas that were not, equally far to the west, they just totally got blown away and took a lot longer for the area to rebuild, whereas Coral Gables, the homes were built extremely strong. And, people wrote it out or didn't, wrote it out and were managed to be able to rebuild, whereas in other areas they weren't able to, and a lot goes back to construction, which I know when Jim was up this way and he was visiting, he commented on construction in North Carolina and out on the Outer Banks is so far below the level of construction that we have in Florida. And I went to a conference this week about Wake County and the future of growth, and they were saying how that's a problem here in general, that homes that were built in the 70s and 80s in the suburbs are not built to the standards of the homes downtown. There's an area called Oakwood, which is very much like, I guess, Miami's Coral Gables, and it has the old, strong-built homes. And they worry a lot about the newer construction, that even more so in the last 10 years, where to cut corners and to make things more affordable, they use a lot of particle-type boards and things that were not built in older homes. And, that had a lot to do with how people... It's not all about location. It's not all about, I'm far... As long as I'm not on the ocean and I'm past the flood zone and I'm west of Dixie Highway or west of I-95, I'll be safe. And I think that there's a lot of also illusion. Lastly, Miami and South Florida in general is home to so many people that are constantly moving in and moving out, that there have been a lot of people that didn't live here since the storms that we remember 7 years ago, let alone Andrew and other storms.
You're right. There's an awful lot of people here who do not have hurricane experience. But I will say this, Bobby and Jim, that what I have noticed is that when there's a hurricane on the horizon, people sit up and take notice. And I don't know that they do their preparations properly. There's been studies that say they don't, but I guarantee you that just about everybody's got their eyes wide open when there's actually a hurricane out there.
Yeah.
You see that by the gas stations, and you see that at the lines in Publix. So I think we are an aware community. I don't think that's the problem. What I think you're saying, Bobby, has a lot of validity to it, that, if people don't want to see their home destroyed, they have to make sure that the construction is sound, and if it's not, they got to do stuff to shore up their home.
Yep. All right, Bobby, thanks for calling in, and keep in touch, and let me know what you're up to.
I'll be in touch. I'll be in a couple weeks.
All right, thanks for calling in.
Take care.
Talk to you
Nice
later.
To talk to you, Ken.
Bye now.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Yeah, Ken, I mean, it's you could go on and on about, construction and who's going to get the water and who isn't. But one thing I'll say is I don't really blame anybody for saying I'm getting out of Dodge when a hurricane is coming, regardless of where they live, because a lot of people don't want to put their family through that. But at the same time, like you said, if your house is built well and you're not in a flood zone, I mean, you might as well just stick it out if you have shutters. You can protect your family. But either way, I don't really blame people for either wanting to get out or saying I'm not moving anywhere. It's just we just don't have enough experience down here. I mean, that's the bottom line. We haven't been hit by enough majors to really get an idea in modern times here what we're up against with all the people living down here.
I agree with you. And the thing you have to tell people is if they are going to evacuate, they need to make that decision early. If they're going to get on the road in their car, they need to get on the road before there's a jam. And that usually means 2 to 3 days in advance of a storm. because otherwise, if you're talking about gridlock and you're talking about a Houston situation like in Rita, that's ugly, and you don't want to be stuck in that. And the last thing you want to do is be stuck in your car with a hurricane following you. So that's why you need to make that decision early. You know that the best advice is if you live in an evacuation zone, move inland but not too far. And if you do live inland and your house is pretty secure, stay put.
Are there any stories coming up that you are working on that we should be aware of, or anything in the future that you want to talk about or promote?
Well, I can't give away, secrets to the Miami Herald and the Palm Beach Post, so I don't know if I can talk about that.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm just kidding. We actually have a sharing agreement between the three
Oh,
papers.
okay. You're being funny. All right.
But, hurricane season isn't that far away. You can be sure that I'm going to be doing, some stories which will pertain to, what are we looking at in the future and that sort of stuff. That's what I do every single year, so I don't know how much people want to read about that, but that's what's coming.
Are you, do you go to the national conferences or just the Florida Governors Conference?
These days, I just go to the Florida Governors Conference. I went to the national for many years, and you were saying you were there in New Orleans before Katrina. I was too, so I guess we ran into each other and didn't know it.
Yep.
But in these days of streamlined newspapers and recession, the Florida Governors Conference is really excellent and actually larger, in terms of seminars and attendance than the national. So even though I enjoy the national a lot, I'll just be going to the Governors Conference.
All right. Well, maybe I'll catch you this May coming up, and we'll talk some more.
Sounds good.
All right, Ken. Take care, and thanks again for coming on tonight.
Okay, Jim.
All right. Good night.
Bye.
All right. Ken Kaye, Sun Sentinel, ladies and gentlemen. We had a couple of emails, but they were pretty repetitive regarding what we were already talking about, so I didn't want to ask the same questions twice, so I appreciate the emails. Thanks for the calls, Bobby. Good to hear from you. Wayne in the Bahamas, appreciate you calling even though you couldn't hear us that well. Anyway, for Jim Williams, Bill Phillips, Ken Kaye, thank you for watching tonight, and we'll catch you on the next Weather in the Media show. Good night, everybody.